How would you translate that, Chuck?
Too much Zoom.
Oh, ois gesummt. I gotcha. Okay. Very funny.
Not original, but it's a keeper.
It's funny.
Okay, Daniel, here I'm gonna press record.
I've essentially had to sign a document attesting to, I testify that, David is Jewish and he's involved in Jewish community and he is not, active in Christian circles, right? But it is a very interesting political question. And the brother Daniel case really brought this into the mainstream. And as you said before, that is completely different than and just to also answer James' question before, the Israeli rabbinut is still using a definition that is almost entirely religious in nature. So the rabbinut in Israel doesn't care if you're ethnically Jewish, right? You can be, let's just pick the most extreme case. 3 out of your 4 grandparents could be Jewish, but if it's not your mom's mom, the Israeli rabbinut will say, sorry, you're not halakhically Jewish. Whereas if 3 out of 4 of your grandparents are Jewish and you identify as Jewish, the Israeli government will, of course, allow you in over the right of return. All you need, according to the Israeli government, is 1 out of 4 grandparents and identifying as Jewish. And so the Israeli government doesn't care which one of your grandparents are Jewish. As long as you identify as Jewish, then great, welcome home, you get to get citizenship, right? But those people run into a lot of problems when they get married, or they want to get married in Israel because of this differentiation. This was also a major, or actually, let's talk about one more Supreme Court case, and then we'll move on a little bit. In 1970, and I'll just maybe I'll share my screen for one more second. Bum bum bum. Okay. Here we go. So in 1970, there was another Supreme Court case centered around a guy named Benjamin Shalit. And Benjamin Shalit was a, fully Jewish, Israeli-born, man who ended up being, high up in the military. He was an Israeli naval officer, which is a very honorable thing to do, right? So this is a guy who is living, the ideal of Israeli society, right? He was a naval officer, right? Very well respected. But he ends up meeting a non-Jewish woman in Israel and having children with the non-Jewish woman, right? And then he goes to the interior minister, right? The interior minister is run by the ultra-Orthodox rabbinut, right? It's not a question of citizenship because his kids were obviously citizens of Israel. They were born in Israel, right? If you're born in Israel, you get to be a citizen. And he asked the interior minister, I want my kids to be registered as Jews by nationality. Now, one interesting difference here, he's not arguing to be Jews by religion, right? He knew that his kids would not be considered religious Jews by the ultra-Orthodox court. He wanted his kids to be considered Jewish for census reasons, right? This is just, clearly symbolic, but Israel, like most countries, but Israel even more so, has very strict census data of what percentage of the country is Jewish, right? You can look up, real-time statistics, what percent of Israel is Jewish, what percent is Arab, what percent is Christian. And so he wanted, when the census data to come out, his kids to be part of the Jewish census, right? Very symbolic. He wanted the state of Israel to recognize his Israeli kids as Jewish, right? So the interior minister, again, that has connections to the ultra-Orthodox court, ends up shooting him down and saying, sorry, your kids just aren't Jewish, right? There's nothing we can do, right? When we're arguing about census data in Israel, we want to capture people who are halakhically Jewish, not just, ethnically Jewish. He ends up challenging this interior minister ruling, and he goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ends up ruling in his favor and saying, yes, your children are Jewish by nationality. This ends up leading to further backlash within the ultra-Orthodox community. And so they ended up amending this right of return. And they said, and this is what it currently reads, you are Jewish by nationality within Israel if you are born to a Jewish mother or have converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. So currently, the definition of Jewish identity in Israel, right? I'm talking about for internal census data purposes, is the Orthodox definition of you have to be born to a Jewish mother or convert into Judaism, right? It's not enough if you are a patrilineal Jew, right? Again, nothing to do with his citizenship, but for census data in Israel. So Benjamin Shalit ends up pushing this case a little bit more. We'll do one more case and then we'll talk about the repercussions here, because I think this last case, I think people will find the most interesting. In 1988, there was a woman named Shoshana Beresford, who was an American woman who converts to Judaism through a Reform community. And so she converts in America, she becomes a Reform Jew, and she applies for the right of return. Now, she's granted the right of return because the right of return, again, she is a part of the Jewish people. She identifies as Jewish. So great, welcome home. You are a citizen of Israel. She then asks internally and says, hey, can I be counted as Jewish for internal census purposes? The interior minister, again, they say no. They say, sorry, you did not convert through an Orthodox conversion. You are not able to be considered Jewish for census data. She ends up challenging this again. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Israeli Supreme Court ends up ruling in her favor. This was a huge Supreme Court case for non-Orthodox Jewish communities in America, and says that anybody who converts to Judaism through any denomination, they are not just eligible for right of return, but need to actually be considered Jewish by national census data in Israel. This means, right, that technically, right, and I say technically because this is still getting sorted out, if you want to get married in Israel, you have to do it through a religious wedding. There's no secular marriage in Israel. In recent years, there have been talk of non-Orthodox rabbis able to actually officiate weddings in Israel. So this means that potentially, if there's somebody who an ultra-Orthodox court would not view as Jewish, right? Somebody like Shoshana Beresford, right? They would say, sorry, you did not convert according to Orthodox standards, you're not Jewish. She would still be eligible for right of return under the secular national law of Israel. And she even might be able to get married through a non-Orthodox ceremony in Israel. That's still debated. It's still a little bit unclear what the laws are in Israel. And there have been a couple of recent cases in Israel of people actually trying to perform weddings in explicit challenge to the Israeli rabbanut, right? I'll say it like that. And this is coming from multiple sectors within Israel. And so just to take a big step back here and give just one more, interesting case study, and then we can unpack, through repercussions and questions. In the American Jewish community, let's just start with the easier example, right? There's a reason why I'm talking about Israel. America, right, the communities, because there's no political power, right? It's not as if Reform or conservative or Orthodox has any political power within the American mainstream. So communities can kind of do what they want, right? And that's what's been happening in America for the past 50 years, right? If you go to an Orthodox community, they have their definition of Jewishness. If you go to a Reform community, they have their definition of Jewishness. And to the extent that, yes, we want, Jewish unity, so it's a problem in that sense. But in terms of, legal or political problem, right, it's not a legal or political problem, right? If somebody named, I don't know, Dave is seen as Jewish in a Reform community, but not in an Orthodox community, as long as Dave is happy being in the Reform community, right, it's fine, right? Everybody's happy, right? The Orthodox community can have their own definition and they're over here and they're happy. The Reform community can have their definition, they're over here, so they're happy, right? Dave's happy because he's accepted by his community. So in America, it's not so much of a problem, right? Again, it is a problem if we talk about, the fact that it'd be nice for all Jews to, be unified in America. But in terms of, actual law and politics, right, it's not as if there's any political repercussions. In Israel, there are huge political repercussions. So the last, major interesting case that happened is when the Soviet Union collapsed. In the 1990s, you had about 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union who ended up immigrating to Israel under the right of return, right? So now you have 1 million Jews who are living in the USSR that all of a sudden are now Israeli citizens under the right of return. The problem, as we know from the Soviet Union, is that religion was essentially banned for multiple generations. And so none of the former Soviet Jews had any connection to this religion we call Judaism. Many of them had adopted Christian cultural norms, right? So even though there was no religion in the Soviet Union, right, Christmas was still celebrated as a cultural national holiday. So many Russian Jews or former Soviet Jews, right, just had a custom to every, the same way that many of us eat turkey on Thanksgiving. We don't place much religious emphasis on that, but culturally, right, it doesn't feel like Thanksgiving without, turkey, right? For them, it doesn't feel like Christmas without a Christmas tree, right? Nothing to do with Jesus, but culturally, they, celebrate Christmas. A million of these Jews come to Israel. And one more, important aspect, there were no rabbis in the Soviet Union, right? And so it's not like anybody was keeping track of halachically who was Jewish and who was not. The Soviet Union did force Jews to mark on their passport if they were ethnically Jewish. So if I lived in the former Soviet Union, I would have a small J on my passport, but all that meant was I was ethnically Jewish. The Soviet Union didn't care if that meant father or mother. And there was a lot of intermarriage that happened in the Soviet Union between Jews and non-Jews. So this presented a massive problem for Israel. Israel, under, again, the secular national law of right of return, any former Soviet Jew was welcomed into the country. But then when a lot of these Jews tried to get married, the ultra-Orthodox court, right, what oftentimes happens when you try to get married, right, is the rabbi in Israel or in the Orthodox community will look at your background and will look at your parents and grandparents and just confirm that you're Jewish. And what happened in the Soviet Union is they were hitting a brick wall because there were no ketubas, right? Nobody was getting religiously married. If people got divorced, there were no gets, there was no contracts, right? Nobody had any idea. All they knew is that, some vague notion of Cindy is ethnically Jewish, right? What that means, if that means halachic, if that means one of her parents, if that, right? There was no data on any of this. This ends up creating a lot of problems in the 90s, and arguably still today, there's repercussions where a lot of the former Soviet Jews, if they wanted to be accepted as fully halachically Jewish by the Israeli mainstream, actually had to undergo a expedited conversion process, right? This was sort of a unique evolution in Jewish law. They're, generally to convert to Orthodox Judaism, it's a long, laborious, multi-year process where you have to essentially commit to keeping full Orthodox law. Many Orthodox rabbis in the 90s said for Soviet Jews, because they are essentially in this category of maybe Jewish, maybe not Jewish, they're going to allow for an expedited conversion process that is going to allow them to convert, even if it's clear that they're not going to be fully halachically observant. But the backlash in the former Soviet crowd, and you can still see this today, the most anti-Haredi political party in the last 20 years of Israeli politics was Avigdor Lieberman, right? Just a little bit about Israeli politics. Avigdor Lieberman was, very right-wing, right? So, former Soviet Jews tend to be very right-wing, right? Sort of understandable after, what happened in the Soviet Union. But the most anti-ultra-Orthodox party was also Avigdor Lieberman, and he got his seats in the Knesset based off of the former Soviet vote. And this is still true today, right? Again, I'm talking about generalities. Obviously, you can meet individuals that don't fit these trends, but the Russian community in Israel tends to be very critical of the ultra-Orthodox community because their identity as Jews was put into conflict. So, just to take, many steps back, and then we can talk about a couple of questions. Because of our history and because of the fact that both internally Jewish identity is complicated, right? Religion, ethnicity, nation, because of the fact that externally our history has been complicated, right? We faced lots of anti-Semitism from lots of different directions throughout history. Now that we have a nation state, right? Israel, and the mission of Israel is to protect both Jews and Judaism. This leads to probably the most interesting debate about Jewish identity that we've had in 2,000 years, which is, what does it mean to be Jew? And what does it mean that Israel is Jewish? And this debate is still ongoing. You can see this, right? Probably the most intense debates outside of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within the Israeli public sphere revolve around this very issue. If people remember, actually the Yom Kippur, 5 days before October 7th, or maybe 10 days before October 7th, Yom Kippur 2023, there was a major, almost brawl that ensued within Tel Aviv because an ultra-Orthodox group was running public services in Tel Aviv, and they were using a mechitza separating the genders, and Israel allows local municipalities to come up with the laws that govern their municipalities. So if you go to Bnei Barak, which is a very religious community in Israel, Bnei Barak is able to say it is illegal for, say, somebody to drive on Shabbat, right? And it's illegal for somebody to open their restaurant on Shabbat. If you go to Tel Aviv, which is more secular, Tel Aviv says it is illegal to have, to have public areas where you forbid women from going in, right? Israel, because of the complexity of religion and politics, says we're not going to give a federal guideline to this, right? Municipalities have to figure this out. An ultra-Orthodox group in Tel Aviv explicitly held a public service separating men and women. This was counter-protest on Yom Kippur. You have two Jewish groups that essentially went to physical blows against each other because of this, and the police had to get involved, and it was a whole mess, right? This question, right, centers around the question we've been asking is, what does it mean for a state to be Jewish, right? Religiously Jewish, culturally Jewish, ethnically Jewish. Even once we come up with that definition, who's to decide? And Israel, again, right, I don't want to use the term still hasn't figured this out because it's essentially an impossible question to figure out. And, one of the interesting things of our time is that for the last 2,000 years, I mean, just like so many things in Judaism, for the last 2,000 years, a lot of these questions were hypothetical, right? If you went into your average shtetl in the 1600s or 1700s, right, everybody knew who somebody who was Jewish was. It was a person that was around the Jewish community, right? It was a very, sociological definition, right? Who is Jewish? Somebody who identifies as Jewish and somebody who seems Jewish to the rest of the Jewish community. And oftentimes what happened is, say your identity was even suspect, right? So say, right, you were the product of a forbidden relationship, somebody who in the halachic literature you call a mamzer, right? One of the worst categories you can be in Judaism is a mamzer, right? Somebody who is a child of a forbidden relationship, because a mamzer is not allowed to marry somebody who's Jewish, and they're not allowed to marry somebody who's not Jewish. So essentially you have to live your life alone, right? It's a terrible category to be in. What would happen in the Middle Ages is if you were a mamzer, you would just go to the next city, not tell anyone, and you would just assimilate into the next city, right? You would just introduce yourself, hi, I'm, Baruch, the, baker, and, okay, great. And, within 2 years, nobody would know, right? There was no social media. Nobody has your, past history. Today, with Israel, all these issues are sort of put into the mainstream, right? Now there is meticulous records on everybody, right? Now there is a way to figure this out, and there are a lot of people who are in this gray area of Jewish according to one definition, not Jewish according to another definition, and it's very difficult to actually sort out, right, what should be done about this. And people can have strong opinions on all sides, right? It's not so. It wasn't really my goal to give opinions of, I think this group is right, or this group is right, or this group is right. But just understanding the different tensions at play, I think get us to a moment where today, regardless of what we think Jewish identity is or should be, or who should, view which other people as Jews, or, do we think one group has too strong of a too strict of a definition of Jewish identity? Do we think another group has too loose of a conception of Jewish identity? I hope that we can actually have greater understanding now for why different groups in the Jewish community end up landing where they are, because there was a lot of historic, both religious, philosophic, and anti-Semitic pressures that ended up molding these different definitions to the point where wherever one lands on these issues, it sort of makes sense, right? It makes total sense historically and philosophically why somebody from a ultra-Orthodox background would only see, or from an Orthodox background would only see certain people as Jewish and not others. And it makes total sense why the Reform movement would have a much more expansive definition of who is Jewish. It makes total sense why the Israeli secular Supreme Court would not see Jews who adopt a different religion as Jewish. And this is just, again, the one of the many complicated soups within the modern Jewish community. So thank you for letting me go a couple minutes over time. I'm happy to hang out if anyone has any thoughts or questions. But I do know some people have to go at 10:30. Yeah, go for it, Chuck, and then Ray.
Couple things. One, during World War II, there were children who were protected by Christian families who were baptized, and the church said they're no longer Jewish, and these amounted to kidnappings. A terrible situation, but very humorous. I read about a dozen years ago a newly minted Reform rabbi who was marrying a guy who was conservative. And for his rabbi to marry them, because her mother was not Jewish, she was Jewish in Reform, but not in conservative. She went through a conversion. And she described the conversion as being no training, because after all, she's a rabbi. And her Beit Din consisted rather of three people facing her. She sat around a table with three rabbis and they had a chat for an hour. So it was very respectful and very well done. But
Yeah, and even in some elements of the Orthodox community, there's starting to be sort of changing mentality on this. Um, there are a lot of people, right? I mean, I just, from firsthand experience, I work on campus, and I can say probably 33, right? One third of the students I work with are probably in a category where if they went to an Orthodox community, they would not be seen as halakhically Jewish, but they are fully involved in the Jewish community. That's their entire identity. They're, fully on board with, not just Jewish holidays and Jewish learning, Zionism, Jewish statehood, you know, their entire friend groups are Jewish, right? Like on paper, they are fully Jewish. And so even in the Orthodox community, I've actually been really pleasantly surprised to see this in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of cases of sort of similar to what you just outlined, Chuck, even in the Orthodox community, of sort of a very quick, right? Probably not that quick, but like a very quick expedited conversion. There was actually a responsa. I'm forgetting the name of the rabbi. It was a Israeli Orthodox rabbi a couple of years ago who wrote a responsa where generally, this is probably not news to anybody. Jews don't proselytize, so you're never going to have, right? And even on the contrary, if somebody not Jewish goes to a rabbi and says, "I want to convert," the rabbi will say, "No, you don't," right? You'll try to push them away. You'll try to say, "Oh, it's really complicated," right? Why bother, right? The Talmud says you push them away 3 times. This responsa was saying, if somebody is involved in the Jewish community but not halachically Jewish, not only should you not send them away, you should actually encourage them to convert, right? It's a very interesting response because what essentially it acknowledges is that this binary of Jewish and not Jewish essentially is not true anymore, right? That there are people that everybody recognizes as not Jewish, and there are people that everybody recognizes as fully Jewish, and then there is a middle category that even if you're Orthodox, you have to acknowledge if somebody is fully involved in Jewish community, has been going to synagogue their whole life, goes to Jewish summer camp, is involved in Jewish community, right? Is involved in Jewish learning, is on board with Zionism and the nation, Jewish nation state building, and they happen to, their mom's mom say wasn't Jewish, but the other 3 of their 4 grandparents were Jewish and they only grew up with a Jewish identity. It's very difficult to say that person's not Jewish. Now, even though in the Orthodox community, they will say, "Sorry, you're technically not Jewish." In those cases, a lot of Orthodox rabbis will try to very quickly, do what you said, right? It's still not a perfect solution because, just like what happened to a lot of the former Soviet Jews, right? It was the same thing, right? These expedited conversions, it's still not, how do I say this nicely? It's still not the healthiest thing for people's self-identity to, after your whole life being Jewish, be told by somebody, "Oh, sorry, you're not Jewish. You have to, jump in a mikvah and do all these other things to be considered Jewish." But it speaks to these tensions. Ray, go for it.
I wanted to ask, so when our formative story about how we came about the exodus from Egypt, and among the people, the hordes were the part of the Israelites and others not. That they were all they were all at Sinai. And so has any decision about somebody saying they're Jewish and being part of the Jewish community, and even though legalistically, according to the Orthodox, they're not, has anybody ever used that scenario as being the reason that you make a decision that somebody who's part of the community, they've come along on the journey, that makes them part of who we are?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure. That's my honest answer. My only thought is that you do have characters in the Torah, right? Like Yitro, Moses' father-in-law. He doesn't really, I mean, he clearly never converts from the story. And it actually seems like at the end of the story in the book of Exodus, he actually leaves, right? He accompanies, right?
Hmm.
He's at Sinai. He actually gives Moses advice on how to, run the court system in the desert. And then it seems like he leaves. Now, the Talmud later on ends up trying to smooth it over by saying, of course he converted, right? But from the Torah's perspective, it's kind of clear that there were people that were not fully Israelite, but a part of the Israelite community. I mean, we even have, I mean, there's a term in the Torah called the Ger Toshav. And a Ger Toshav, right, just from the, we can parse the words. A Ger is somebody who's a stranger, right? Later on, a Ger will be interpreted as convert, but literally what a Ger means is a stranger, right? And a Toshav, right, comes from the word like Yashav, which means, who's sitting, who's settled, right? So a Ger Toshav is sort of a oxymoron. It's a stranger who's settling with you, right? In other words, somebody living in ancient Israel who's not Israelite. But one of the interesting things, and the Torah actually explicates this, a Ger Toshav has certain religious obligations that non-Jews don't. And so one of the interesting examples is, right, the Korban Pesach, right, or the, a Ger Toshav is required to participate in Passover, right, even though they're not Jewish, right? So even the Torah does kind of recognize this limbo category of not fully Jewish, not actually Jewish. Now, the Talmud, as it often does with contradictions within the Tanakh and the Torah, attempts to smooth it over. And the Talmud says, well, a Ger Toshav is really just a full convert, right? So that explains it. But if we were to actually understand the Torah at face value, right, it's probably closer to what you were talking about, Reyes. But so yeah, arguably, I mean, just another, I guess, way to summarize this is, because of the complexity of Jewish identity, there's always going to be a gray area, right? We can spend the rest of the year coming up with the best written definition of Jewish identity, and we're always going to meet somebody who fits some gray area there. It hasn't stopped people from trying. So the Talmud tries, right? Different Jewish groups today try to come up with a very precise definition, but it's very unclear and very difficult. And so this is my personal opinion, right? I do think, because of this, in America, I think different communities should be able to, kind of have their own definition. I mean, just like if I open a coffee shop, I should be able to serve whatever type of coffee I want, right? If you open a synagogue, you should be able to come up with whatever definition of Judaism you want, right? I do think that most American Jewish groups should err on the side of being more open, because I do think, Jewish identity is becoming, right, today, and right, let's just take an example on campus, right, in 2025. It's not a very simple thing in 2025 to be publicly Jewish on an American college campus. And so if somebody is explicitly becoming a part of the Jewish community, wearing, say, a Jewish star around campus, which again comes with certain social and, probably not often physical, but potentially physical repercussions, right, as we've seen lately in America, right? It's very difficult to then say, oh, sorry, you're not actually Jewish, right? And so we actually started off, I think a month ago was right after the DC shooting, and Yaron, the man who was killed, he was actually Christian, right? But his father was Jewish. And so, right, again, right, he never identified as Jewish, so it was a little bit easier to sort of say, okay, yes, right, he doesn't identify as Jewish. Most definitions of Jewish identity wouldn't consider him Jewish. But let's say he had identified as Jewish, right? Just by having a Jewish father, and he was killed for being a Jew. It'd be very difficult to, write, well, he technically wasn't Jewish, right? That would be a very difficult thing to write. And I think, right, again, we can talk about how much of this is internal, how much of this is external. But certainly after the Holocaust, I mean, because the Holocaust targeted a very wide range of Jews, right? Anybody who had a Jewish grandparent was essentially considered tainted under the Nuremberg laws. After the Holocaust, you can't really tell a Holocaust survivor you're not really Jewish after spending, 6 years in Auschwitz, because they have the wrong grandparent as Jewish, right? That's sort of a non sequitur. And so the Jewish community, I think, has in kind adapted. And today, even in the Orthodox community in America, until you get married, there's sort of a don't ask questions policy, right? If you go to even an Orthodox synagogue in America and you present as Jewish, you will be totally welcome in, you know, everything. Now, again, later on, if you want to get married and the rabbi's looking into your background, then you might hit some hiccups. But, you know, the Jewish community in general has erred on the side of being more inclusive and accepting, which is almost certainly a good thing. Anyway, thank you all so much. I do hope that you'll all join me for the next class. I think it's starting at the last Monday in June. And there'll be more information. I'll send out more information about that as well. But we'll cover a lot of, you know, fun modern Jewish questions. Not really connected to this, but if you enjoyed this, I think it'll be, you know, somewhat similar in the style. So thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful Monday. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Great class.
See ya. Great. It was great.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.